Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. The beginning of African American contributions to the United States happened right here in Hampton Roads, specifically along the shore of the Chesapeake Bay at Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia, the site of the first landing of Africans to English North America. Up next on Another View, we'll talk about that first landing and how Fort Monroe played a pivotal role in slavery and emancipation. We'll not only look back, but look forward as Virginia prepares to celebrate the 400th year of the beginning of our nation. It's an Another View history lesson. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Discussing today's topics from an African American perspective, this is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Today's Another View history lesson is about the arrival of the first Africans to English North America. For centuries, we were taught that the first Africans to arrive in this country started their lives in Jamestown in 1619, but recent discoveries now show that the first Africans were actually brought to Old Point Comfort, which today is a part of Hampton, Virginia, and more specifically, Fort Monroe. Our Lisa Godley has more on that first arrival and the first Black family to call this region their home.
The first Africans arrived in Virginia in late August 1619. 60 men and women had been captured in South Central Africa and were on a Portuguese ship bound for Mexico when it was attacked by two pirate ships, the White Lion, whose home port was England, and the Treasurer, whose home port was Jamestown.
They were attacking Portuguese and Spanish ships of their gold and silver. So they were a pirate ship who, on this occasion, accidentally attacked a ship carrying Africans.
They took the Africans. Some went on the Treasurer, some on the White Lion. But a violent storm caused the two ships to separate. The White Lion set sail for Jamestown, but ended up dropping anchor at Old Point Comfort. The Africans were traded in exchange for food. The majority were dispersed among the colonies.
Two of them stayed at Point Comfort and became servants in the home of Captain William Tucker. And Antonio and Isabella is the couple that gave birth to the first African child born in America who became William Tucker.
The Tucker family has always taken pride in being descendants of the first African child born in Virginia.
King Jesus in the cattle by the waterside, you see the little child with his toy baptized.
We don't know if Anthony and Isabella knew each other, but they were married apparently after they arrived. And William Tucker was the first African child born in the Virginia colony. And the child was baptized.
A marker on the shores of Hampton's Point Comfort shares the story of Anthony and Isabella's arrival.
20-some-odd Negroes on the ship, the White Lion, came to Point Comfort. Captain William Tucker, who was commanding this fort, selected two people to work his plantation.
They named their first child after him, and upon the captain's death, he left land to their son, William Tucker, which stayed in the family for many generations.
We visited Bluebird Gap Farm, not knowing anything, and when we got there, my father said, this was our home, this is where we were.
In fact, the Tucker family cemetery is just a few miles away from what is now Hampton's historic Aberdeen Gardens community.
My father and I spent a lot of time together in his business and cleaning the cemetery. And when we cleaned the cemetery, that's when we had the conversation. He told us about the land that was given to Captain William Tucker and the land that was passed on to the family.
Because of records lost or never kept, many people of African descent can only trace their roots back so far. So for an African American family to be able to trace their roots back to 1619 is rare. But the Tuckers didn't stop there. The youngest of the siblings, William, took a DNA test.
The segment of DNA is presently found in Africa's Ghana region. According to our test, we see that you are a part of the African tribes from that region that entered the country at that time frame.
A trip from Africa to the Virginia coast, beginning a family's legacy that now takes its rightful place in American history. For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
Now, 1619 was also the year of the first representative legislative assembly in the New World. Women had a significant impact on the Virginia colony, and the first English Thanksgiving was held. So there was a lot going on then. We have a lot to talk about on this Another View history lesson. So let's meet our guest, our favorite historian and newly named Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Norfolk State University, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. Hey, Cassandra.
Hi, Barbara.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
We're very proud of you. That's so
you.
awesome. And he's the superintendent of the National Park Service, Fort Monroe National Monument, Mr. Terry Brown. Hey, Terry, how you doing?
Barbara, how you doing? It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for joining me. So, lots of history, lots of discrepancy, lots of people just trying to pull this whole thing together. But let's go back to 1619. And Cassandra, I'm going to start with you. Kind of set the stage, if you will. The two ships got separated. This ship winds up at Point Comfort. What was happening in America at that point? What did these first Africans experience?
Well, I guess in order to talk about that, let me just put some things into perspective. The London Company, which was a privately owned company with permission of the king, set up a colony. It was supposed to make money. They thought they were finding gold for the first 2 years, and they didn't. And it was John Rolfe who really helped that colony by 1616 to develop a special crop, which was a hybrid tobacco, hybrid from Barbados and from Virginia. This particular hybrid tobacco plant would be sweet, but could withstand the summers of the Virginia weather. And that became an important crop that ensured that the colony would not just completely fold.
So that became its gold in a sense.
Exactly. And so that is what slowly fueled the coming to Virginia of a number of these people. Of course, they weren't calling it Virginia. They called the colony Jamestown. And, it's difficult when people are looking back because words and ideas get co-opted to mean something sometimes very differently as we move forward. And so from the turn of the 20th century until now, the area of what we call today Jamestown kind of co-opted that name to only represent that site. Whereas
excluding Point Comfort or
correct,
Fort Monroe.
Correct. Okay. Whereas in the time period of the 17th century, Jamestown was the name of the colony. So if you were talking about the fort, or if you were talking about what they call New Jamestown, which was sort of the city right outside, not city, but little borough right outside of the fort, they had a slightly different name, and they would distinguish that from when they would say Jamestown. And so because words and places got co-opted, there's been a special effort made for people to understand that this part of Hampton that we call, that at that time it was part of the Kicquetan village, it was an Indian village, and then it got taken over by the English, that part and where we see Fort Monroe, which is where Point Comfort was located, that those were all considered part of Jamestown. So when we talk Jamestown, it's the entire colony, and they simply use that term to refer to the entire colony. But I think it's important that we understand the different locations of places, because places have meaning, they have memory, they have archaeological items that help us to really understand a time period that people weren't documenting as much as we would like for them to have documented. But it's because their interest was not really establishing something, but instead it was making money.
So, Terry, part of your challenge then, based on what Cassandra was just saying about place and about you're not really redefining the history, but actually bringing it into context. That's a challenge that you all are facing at Fort Monroe now. Is that right?
It's a challenge for a superintendent to come into a space like this where the history spans over 400 years. And part of that history involves Black people. When you think about what happened at Fort Monroe, if I was to walk up to you and say, this is a space where Black people were introduced in the British colonies, right? And then 242 years later, this is the same location where they would begin to unravel slavery. And then in the same breath, I told you that 150 years from that moment, the very first Black president, with all the powers possessed to that one person, made Fort Monroe a national monument. And then I sit into this chair today as superintendent of a space where all that happened. It's amazing.
Not to mention that you happen to be an African-American male in a field that doesn't have a lot of African-American superintendents.
That's true. Absolutely. We can count on my hand. 1, 2.
So the history just keeps on happening.
Yes, and it's an amazing opportunity for the nation. I would imagine a lot of people don't know about what happened at Fort Monroe. But when I drive through Fort Monroe, if you were just going through the front gates, you would see a guard shack. And it looks like a military base. It has all those old buildings that date back to the early 1800s. There's these beautiful view sheds. There's an RV park at Fort Monroe. I mean, it's a lot of beautiful spaces. But carved underneath all of that is 10,000 years where American Indians used it as a strategic location to fish and hunt. It's where early colonists would arrive in 1607, and just shortly after they arrive, years later, the very first Africans come off a ship. And a lot of us get caught up in what happened in 1619. I'm more caught up in what happened to those people. I mean, just imagine for a second, they're captured from their homeland. They're shipped across these waters into God knows where, the Spanish colonies of South and Central America, and then they would eventually land here over a period of time. And they get off this ship, and there is no one that looks like them. Yeah. There's a pause there for a reason, because I want the audience to understand that when they get off at Old Point Comfort, it's a game changer. Life is different. Their culture is different. The smell, the sound, everything is different. And we can go from there.
And they weren't when they got off the ship at that point, they were not slaves, or were they? Or were they indentured? So I know that they were traded, but were they considered indentured servants, Cassandra, or were they considered enslaved people at that point?
They were probably considered enslaved people. England had not yet, and I should say the company officials, had not yet established any kind of policy for enslavement in the colonies. But because African slavery, for as far as the Europeans were concerned, had been in existence for well over 150 years by that time, then the perception was that these people who had, by the way, been captured in war, so they were war captives, these individuals who were captured in warfare sold to the Portuguese, and Portuguese, by the way, were very involved with a lot of this warfare. They would pay people to operate as mercenaries, to go in and seize people or start a war for the purpose of seizing individuals. And so these individuals were captured. Many of them already had quite a bit of a familiarity with Portuguese language, with culture, with religion and ideas. And so they were then cast into a whole different environment.
From?
It is in the area of they believe the Ndongo Kingdom. In fact, John Thornton and Linda Haywood have done a lot of research in the archives in Portugal and Spain, where a lot of this material is residing, as well as in England, to piece together this very I'm not going to say secret, but really underrepresented accounting of what happened. So you have to put pieces together from all different places. And the pirating was a part of it, as Lisa explained in the beginning in her clip. And so you're talking about this world of pirating, this world that already accepted as a given that people being transported from the west coast of Africa, or even from from anywhere on the western coast of Africa, that these individuals would be enslaved. Then the perception of the English was to simply regard them as enslaved people. In fact, when you look at these early records, anywhere from 1619 to the 1630s, some of the Africans are listed with both a first and a last name, which kind of suggests something else. But most of them were either unnamed or only listed with a first name. And, if you are considered a full human being capable of having civil rights, your surname is critical because it gives you a sense of self-identity and a place in society that is respected. If you come with no name or you come with only a first name, it suggests your status is low or disregarded. And so we saw that almost from the beginning, these individuals from West Africa, particularly from that area of what we call Angola and the Congo today, that those individuals were not seen as full humans with all the rights and privileges and humanity that you would give to other individuals. And throughout the records, we see that then this new legislative body that was created would begin to limit even further or define further what their limited rights, if any, were. And so it is not coincidental that these kinds of things happened almost at the same time, because you're seeing a colony that's still struggling to survive, and even through pirating, wanting to survive. And then you're seeing a colony or officials in that colony who now want to expand it. And that expansion means whatever we can get. Any kind of laborers we can get, that's what we'll pull in and utilize to ensure that this colony survives. And with the intensity of labor that was required for tobacco, then these individuals became, even though they were small in number, by the 1620s, you had about 50 plantations in this region that was called the Jamestown Colony, that was later renamed the Virginia Colony. And in that, you had 8 plantations that had Africans on it, and they were scattered
8 out of the 50.
Out of the 50, but they were scattered almost evenly in that space. They were small in number, but because of how they were scattered in place, and they were placed on the most important plantations, because these were the officials of the colony. Because of that, they seemingly had a tremendous impact on the evolution of culture that would emerge. Most culinary historians, when they're talking about the evolution of Southern food, it happened right here in Hampton Roads. And it happened with these early Africans coming in and where they were placed and the jobs that they were being forced to do and the foods that were brought along with these individuals as the transatlantic slave trade began to come more regularly to Virginia as we get into the 18th century. They began to develop a food cuisine that we call Southern, that started right here.
Right here. You mentioned that there were people who did have their full name.
Yes.
On the census. What did that mean in terms of their stature?
The suggestion is that that it's possible that the people who claimed ownership of those individuals may have allowed them or permitted them or had some sort of agreement with them to eventually become free.
Okay.
Because you very seldom would see anybody who was free listed in the records, and that includes indentured servants who were white. You very seldom would see anybody with a first and last name.
Okay.
And so some of the white indentured servants who came from Europe didn't just come from England. Some of them came from Ireland and other places. Some of them negotiated their contracts, and some were forced to come. Some woke up in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on their way here. And so it kind of really tells you a lot about their status.
Were any Africans indentured servants? Or for the most part, as far as we know about the history, they all came as slaves?
Yes, that's why I like to use the word unfree.
Yeah, I use that word.
Okay.
As well. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's because there was no
There was no
legal
legal slave.
establishment, but for all, for the purposes of discussion, they did not have a choice in the matter.
So, Tara, if we come over to Fort Monroe, I know there's a museum there and some other things. What are some of the artifacts or what do we see that kind of helps to develop this narrative about what happened?
Well, I think that's the most challenging part about what we're talking about, because we're talking about a group of people who were in this space and they impacted this region so significantly. So when you drive through Fort Monroe, you're not going to see a lot of evidence that they were there. I mean, we have a marker that we've been able to put up that highlights the fact that they were there. But people go where they're comfortable. If you don't see yourself in this space, it's very hard as a manager of this space to say, come to Fort Monroe and experience what happened here. It's kind of a hard sell. But what I'm aiming at is to remind people that Africa is a beautiful place. Being black is absolutely beautiful. Africa is the second largest continent to Asia, right? There is as much diversity in Africa as there is in all the continents put together. They speak over 2,000 languages. We come from greatness. So when we're talking about people coming off a ship, they're enslaved, I want people who are visiting to humanize that a little bit. Because when you understand where we came from, it's hard to hate what you don't know. It's hard to hate me when you know about me. Like, think about this for a second. Africans, when they left Africa, they either left as free people or enslaved, right? And when they come into this region, they're bringing their music, their words, their religion, their aesthetic values, their aesthetic values, right? All these things are important. They already knew how to cultivate rice, sugar, and cotton. All that was important in developing a hybrid American culture. That was very important. We just didn't show up and go, yeah, we want to stay in this situation you're putting us in. It didn't happen like that. Yeah. People fought this system. It was brutal. It was ugly. And that's a conversation that I'm trying to prep anyone within 5 feet of me. Because next year is a very important year. It's not a celebration, it's a commemoration. It's an acknowledgement of a country that made a mistake. It would not be the country it is without black people being involved. You can walk through Fort Monroe and look at that stone fort, which is the largest one in the world, and black people built that.
Wow.
When you walk through the main gates of Fort Monroe, when you go through that main gate, it was 3 enslaved people who changed the course of history. They triggered the Emancipation Proclamation through their actions.
And I want to talk in more detail about that a little bit as we get further in. But Cassandra, then tell me in terms of, like you said, they brought their own culture and foods and so forth, but it was hard living here.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, so you had the first 20 who were brought in August of 1619. And those 29 who were on the second ship, the Treasurer, who arrived 4 days later, they were turned away and they were taken to Bermuda. And then they stayed there until February. 7 of them were brought who were still part of that group. 7 were brought back to the colony in February of 1620. By April of 1620, there were 32 Africans recorded to be in the colony. But by 1624-25, they have the census, that 1624-25, there were only 21 listed. Now, we have very little evidence of how many continued to be brought in from 1620 until that time period. But clearly, mortality was an issue for everybody. We know that the English were completely devastated year after year after year. But it was impacting also the Africans. It was a very rough environment. Anybody who's been through a summer in Hampton Roads, all you have to do is visualize no air conditioning and visualize poor health care or no health care. Visualize that you are creating out of a space that you're unfamiliar with, a home. And you're trying to survive in that home. And also keep in mind now that the native peoples in this region were not just sitting around waiting for people to take over their homes. There was warfare. There was, from 1619 until 1640, there was constant warfare going on. So people were dying not just from diseases, but because of warfare, because their homes were being taken over and they were fighting back. And so this was a very, very unsettled time period. And of course, healthcare was non-existent, and people died young. And many people didn't survive more than 4 or 5 years after arriving here, which is why it was very hard for the company to succeed, because it was hard after a while to get people to come here because life was hard. So the Africans who came here, what is amazing to me is that those who survived, they not only survived, but they thrived because they had children. Imagine you're captured in war, you're taken thousands of miles from your home to a completely new environment. You don't have immunities to some of the things that are in this environment. And yet you not only survive that, but you thrive and you have children. And those children then are the Creoles. They're the ones who are first generation born, sharing the culture of their parents with this new cultural environment, and they create something that's very unique to America. In fact, the famous novelist Ralph Ellison wrote in 1970 an article, what would America be without the Negro? And that whole idea, when you think about those things that define America, that set America apart, aside from the concept of democracy, what is it? It's our culture. And the culture has its feet firmly planted in the African American experience.
If you're just joining us, it's an Another View history lesson on 1619 and the making of America with historian and Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at NSU, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, and Mr. Terry Brown, Superintendent of the National Park Service, Fort Monroe National Monument. So let's fast forward for a little bit because we only have an hour to get through all of this history. But they did have children, and they did start to multiply. And what was the relationship between Africans and Native Americans in terms of Fort Monroe, or in terms of this beginning? Did they intermingle? Was there any kind of relationship at all, or was it all war?
So in some cases, they were treated the same way the Europeans were treated as far as the Native Americans were concerned. They were in their space.
Okay.
And in other cases, you saw intermingling. In fact, I always, when people talk about DNA testing, if anybody has been in these places where people have been involved for at least 400 years, it is almost impossible to say that there has not been this constant intermingling. And keep in mind also that while the limited legislative body that was created in 1619 set up some laws that said, we're not going to enslave Native people, because they wanted to have trade relations and all this. They enslaved Native people. And what they would do is they would capture, and there are a number of books written about this, they would capture Native Americans throughout Virginia, and they would sell them to other places as slaves. So sometimes they would sell them into the Plymouth colony, and later in Massachusetts Bay or Massachusetts colony. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they would sell them into the Carolinas. Sometimes it would be different parts of Virginia. And so through that process, it naturally put Native and African peoples together. And of course, the intermingling was ongoing and constant.
It's just mind-boggling to me that people who were here were sold. Right. As you know, I mean, just trying to wrap your mind around that is just incredible, Terry.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of enslaving someone is a brutal and dark condition and situation. I mean, I think that's the reason why it's so hard to have a conversation about race, because it forces you to dig deep into the definition a little bit, because you take away due process. You darken.
You darken everything.
You darken everything. In order for a person to say, I accept slavery, you have to sap manhood out of them. And that's an ugly picture.
So let's talk about the three slaves who through Fort Monroe started the emancipation of black people in this country. What happened there, and how come, you can answer this part, Cassandra, how come we never learned about these three gentlemen? At least I didn't learn about them in school, and I am praying that we're teaching our kids this history now. So we'll tackle that in a second, but what happened?
Well, as you know, Africans arrived in 1619. So 242 years later, we have the Civil War in full engagement. And there are enslaved people working across the waters helping the Confederates build some of their fortifications. And in the middle of the night, and we don't really know what the conditions were. All I can tell you is I've sat on the side of the seawall and looked out at the water, and I know at times that's a pretty difficult thing to navigate. And it must have been pretty scary. They left that scene. Now, keep in mind, the Civil War is ongoing. Virginia cedes from the Union. The fort remains in Union control. That's a very important thing. It's in Union hands. So there's a lighthouse there. And that must have been a little beacon to say, that's a safe place to go. Yeah. There are other factors. They arrive, and there's a lot of things that are happening. When you leave, you're putting your family in jeopardy. You could be killed. I mean, there's a brutal situation that could have turned out. They show up at the main gates. They're seeking asylum. There's a general that shows up. Sometimes we highlight the significance of what General Butler did, but the real significance is that these three enslaved men, today we call them James Townsend, Shepard Mallory, and Frank Baker. When they arrive, just imagine these men looking disheveled, scared, probably cold, and someone at the gate makes a wise decision to bring them in. And what happens is the next day, 7 people show up. By Monday, 70. And within October time frame, we got 900 enslaved people making their way to Fort Monroe, and then thousands and thousands of people are showing up there. And if you can envision what this looks like, it's horses, it's people coming in unclothed. It's a real scary and dark situation.
And they all just stayed. I mean, they just slept on the land. They were just there. Because I mean, it wasn't like they were hotels there waiting for these folks. How did they do this?
It's just, it's probably tents. It's probably just laying on the ground. It's a lot of all that kind of stuff happening. But then there's disease and there's uncertainty and there's all this stuff happening in this space because, this is something that's turning into a nightmare for those who are living in this space.
Well, I was going to say,
all these black people showing up.
And how many soldiers were on Fort Monroe at that point? Do we know? How many people were running the fort?
I don't know that number, but
I'm sure they were overwhelmed. They were
definitely overwhelmed, for sure. They were overwhelmed.
Yeah. I know that at one point, around that same time, about 10,000 troops were showing up to be deployed because this was the beginnings of the First Peninsula Campaign. And so they were, I mean, you see some of these images, the drawings that Harper's Weekly did, where you can see just in that picture hundreds of people clustered and all these ships and all these wagons and so forth. And so a lot of these people, I've often wondered, how is it that all of a sudden, after Butler says, okay, I'm going to provide you all with sanctuary rather than return you as would the Constitution tell me to do to your owner, how did all of a sudden these people
get the word out?
Right.
Right.
I wanted the same thing.
Exactly.
Right.
But my thought is that they didn't know, and then they didn't have to know, because this was not the first time that people who were deprived of their freedom sought freedom with the opposition. It's not the first time. Fort Monroe is there because it's not the first time. Fort Monroe was built after the War of 1812. There were two things that really launched that. One of them, of course, was that the British sent ships all the way up and destroyed Washington, D.C. But the other reason is the British were sending ships and taking thousands of enslaved African Americans with them aboard their ships.
They were offering them their freedom.
So Fort Monroe was there so that would never happen again. And so it's not the first time. And of course, the same thing happened during the American Revolution. So this is not the first time that what I call freedom seekers were finding the opposition to hide with or to find sanctuary with them. Not because they believed in whatever the cause was. Their cause was always freedom. And that's the cause of most human beings. When they are deprived of their freedom, they find a way to be free in some form or fashion. And so Fort Monroe has served a lot of interesting purposes, but I think the most important is that it tells the story of America, and it forces America to face a dilemma. You cannot call yourself the land of the free and the home of the brave and enslave over 4 million people in perpetuity. That means not only them, but all their descendants from that point moving forward. You cannot do that and still create a safe zone for yourself. It will always be an unsafe zone. And so the people who are of African descent have done an incredibly good thing for America. And that is that by forcibly bringing people of African descent to this country and forcing them into labor, into an enslaved situation, these individuals have shown not only that humanity cannot be oppressed like that forever, but that their quest for freedom and for equality has helped to define what freedom and equality really means and the price people are willing to pay to achieve that freedom and equality.
And I think the important point you're making is that this is an American story.
Yes.
This is not just for black people. This is for all people. Once you begin to understand what happened to Africans and African Americans now, it really allows us to grow as a nation. We're only 31 years old?
Yeah, roughly.
Listen to this for a second. We're about 241 years. In 1974, they found some bones in the Sahara Desert that dates back 2.3 million years.
Wow. When you put it in that perspective.
So Africa has ashtrays older than this country.
Yeah. Yes.
So when sometimes we don't give ourselves a chance to grow as a nation. This is difficult. It's hard to talk about it. But I think the reason why we're in this room with you is because we want the nation to know it's okay to have this discussion. Yes, it's hard, but we got to do it. We have to do it. Black people made a major contribution to this society, and it wasn't easy being here.
And don't you think that if our children and generations of our children understood this, that it might make a bigger difference in terms of a lot of the social issues that we have to face today.
Right.
Because we don't know where we come from.
Well, and people can be very impactful. Sometimes we almost get people to give up by saying one person can't make a difference.
Right.
One person can make a difference. Those 3 men made a difference because when they went to Butler, when Baker, Shepard Mallory, and Townsend went to Butler, they gave him the argument that he needed to make to provide the Union government with a way to make sure that they would win the war. And what they did was they said, we're being forced to work for the Confederacy, and we don't want to.
We're being forced to build weapons to
Yes.
fight you.
Yes.
And they were considered contraband.
Yes.
So if you're property, okay, we'll keep it in our hands.
Yes.
We'll keep the property right
We'll
here.
keep it right here.
So what happened to the people?
To the people? That's a really good question. What we failed to talk about is the community of Hampton.
Yes.
They would eventually build homes here, and they would, it's sort of like this concentric circle that would eventually move on out. They were here.
Yeah.
I mean, you can find remnants of, that time period here in Hampton, all over the place. There are trees at Fort Monroe that date back 500 years.
Wow.
And Emancipation Oak is over 400 years
It's
old.
over 400 years old.
On the campus of Hampton
Yes.
University.
There were black people reading under those trees.
Yes.
Mary Peak. I mean, we don't have enough time
to do all of the history.
But it was
absolutely.
James Baldwin that reminded me, and I will remind the audience, that if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. And what that really means is you have to learn about this in order to grow. I have to tell you this. We all are in this together, period. I don't care if you're white or black, we're in this together. And it's going to be you and I changing the world today.
Absolutely.
Let's do it.
Absolutely.
So-
And in
Because there
fact-
are a lot of people who really have not heard this history
Right.
and really don't understand.
And let me tell you, when the American Missionary Association was invited to come and help, because the military was not prepared to deal with these thousands of people who were here. So when Lewis Lockwood, who was a minister, came down, he married groups of people who had been living together as husband and wife for years in some cases. 3 of those couples that he married were mixed-race couples with children. And so this idea that we were living in these racial silos never existed in America. It's very artificial. And think about this. Some of the major slave traders in Virginia, like Robert Lumpkin or George Emerson, who was down here in Norfolk, both of them were married to black women. Robert Lumpkin, who ran the Devil's Half Acre, which was the most notorious slave jail in Richmond, was married to a free black woman. And after he died, she inherited all his property, donated the land that jail sat on to create Virginia Union University. They educated their children up in Massachusetts. She eventually married a veteran of the Civil War, an African-American man, and is buried. They moved back to his hometown in Ripley, Ohio. She's buried there. Wow. Then you have Emerson, who married, not legally, but married an enslaved woman, sent their children also up to Massachusetts to be educated, and she inherited all of his property. You can't make this stuff up. So when we embrace who we really are and the complicated world that people lived in, then it becomes interesting. Telling the story of those 3 men who changed the face of America, I think is such an important narrative because it tells you how one person or 3 people can change the face of America.
Wow. So, Terry, you've got some things happening at Fort Monroe, partly in preparation for the 2019 commemoration, but more so because you want this story to live in perpetuity and for everybody to be able to experience this. So tell me some of the things that are changing at Fort Monroe and what people can expect.
Well, I'm really proud of the state of Virginia, the Fort Monroe Authority, the community of Hampton. What we're trying to do is build a legacy. We're going to have a visitor center that will open in August of 2019 that will highlight 1619. And that's a game changer. You come to Fort Monroe, no longer will you just have a sign that say they were here. We will have an exhibit. We will have pamphlets and reading material. We'll have interpreters out there to explain the story. And that will happen from here to eternity as long as I'm here. We will begin to start producing Black Heritage Trail tours. I'm not going to call it that, but it's going to be something that will be offered on a regular basis. That's important. And we're doing that collectively. Mm-hmm. What a way to send a signal to the rest of the world, the role that Virginia played in creating the nation.
And I know that there's also been Cassandra, there's a new app that's out. It's called the 2019 Commemorations Virginia History Trails mobile app. Tell us a little bit about that and what it does for people in terms of learning this whole history.
Well, the Virginia Foundation, which used to be the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, has been collecting through grants offered to different communities throughout the state, opportunities to collect the history of all of these different sites. Mm-hmm. And so this database that has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sites, and in no way comprehensive, because a lot of the sites, even in Hampton Roads, are not there, but it has enough so that it gives people a taste of the incredible history that's right here in Hampton Roads. It's going to be used, hopefully, by not only teachers and students, but by residents in the area who don't even know that they live on sacred ground, that they live in a place that impacted the course of the nation. And so we're hopeful that this is just the beginning of a much larger project that would involve even more sites than that.
I'm trying to locate on my little piece of paper here the actual where people can find it. You can find this app at the American Evolution website, and I don't have that specific name, but
if you just type in American Evolution 2019,
American Evolution 2019, you'll find the app. It is free, and it will take you to places all around. If somebody comes to the museum that is currently at Fort Monroe, what's there? What are they?
Well, it's the history. It captures the history of the military. Jefferson Davis was in prison at Fort Monroe, and there's a cell there. I saw his little teeny bid. The staff there has done a wonderful job of starting to tell the story of Africans in that space. It's a beautiful place, and there's a lot of information, so you need an entire day to be there. So,
now I noticed that both of you kind of paused, I'll say, when I said about education, though. But what do we need to do? And I'll start with you, Cassandra, to make sure that this history gets in our schools, as well as we need to do this at home also in teaching folks, but also to get in our schools. And we got 3 minutes left. So,
okay. So we need to stop teaching history by the numbers. History is about context. It's about understanding what happened in this space and how do we get where we are. And when you begin to connect that, then you begin to really make good citizens, because good citizens not only understand the price that people pay for their freedom and liberty, but also what you need to do to maintain it. Because democracy is not guaranteed, freedom is never guaranteed, it's very easy to lose it. And so teaching these stories helps you to understand how important it is to be a voter, how important it is to understand the value of freedom and what you should do with that. And so that's why I think history should not just be limited to 1, 2, 3 facts.
Gotcha. And Terry, what about educating ourselves so that we can educate our children?
Well, first of all, we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. We really do. And for me, as a manager of that space, the very first budget item on my list is education. I bring every 4th grader and 12th grader to Fort Monroe. They get here. I've invested in teachers coming into that space, writing curriculum that will tell the stories of Fort Monroe and take it back to the classroom. That will be part of my agenda for the years that I'm here. So I think really is about catching people when they're young enough to be influenced, so that when they grow up to be 25, 30 years old, they go, I like that National Park Service thing. I like that story about Africans. I'm very familiar with that. And I'm proud to be a Hamptonite or a Hamptonian, whatever. I want people to walk out of here proud, whether you're black or white. Be proud of this story. Matter of fact, make a shirt that says, I'm okay with the history here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I hope that this whole idea of commemorating 2019 throughout the year, I mean, there are lots of opportunities for people to do that. But why is that so important, that we stop and pause and pay attention?
Because there are more things than we realize impact the way we perceive things. And so it's important to go into those uncomfortable spaces as we really go into the 21st century. 2020 is really, for most historians and sociologists, the beginning of a new century, because you're seeing a passing of a generation going into a new generation with new ideas and thoughts. And so, that's why we're hosting a graphic novel conference and competition September 15th and 16th at Norfolk State University
of 2018
of this year. And the focus is going to be for people to submit proposals talking about and drawing images about the early arrival of the Africans, so that there is a historical context to what they're trying to interpret, to get young people understanding that this world that we know of, the Marvel Comics world, that is more than just that. And once you begin telling that story, then it transforms the way you think about people. That's what the Black Panther is doing for a lot of people when they think about an African country, and hopefully this is going to be the beginning of that turning point for the 21st century.
So we want to encourage everybody to go to American Evolution 2019. Check it out. And this history, as both of you have said, is for everyone. Thank you so very much, Terry Brown, Superintendent at Fort Monroe, and Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, and congratulations again. We really appreciate, or we're really proud of you becoming the new dean of the School of Liberal Arts over at NSU. That's fantastic. And we'll be right back.
I'm with Marcellus, and you all are checking out Another View. Don't go anywhere. Check us out.
And we hope that you've enjoyed this Another View history lesson about Fort Monroe and events that happened in 1619. If you'd like to hear the show again or share it with a friend, please visit our website. It's anotherviewradio.org and download the podcast. And while you're there, please sign up for our eView newsletter, a once-a-week reminder of upcoming shows. We're on Facebook, so like us, and I'm on Twitter at Barbara Ham Lee. Next time on Another View, it's the Another View Roundtable. And of course, we're going to have debates about the social and political issues facing the African American community today. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer, and Victor Bowen is our audio engineer. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Thank you so very much for listening to Another View.